The studio lights were hot and unforgiving, casting a sharp glow over the polished floor. Cameras hovered like watchful eyes, capturing every flicker of expression. Across the table sat Pete Hegseth, a man used to commanding conversations with sharp words and military precision. He leaned forward with a smirk, papers in hand, as if already prepared to deliver a verbal strike. Opposite him was Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in his signature military attire, posture steady and eyes unwavering. The contrast was striking, one man radiating the confidence of media dominance, the other the unshakable resolve of a leader forged in conflict. The host had barely introduced the segment before Hegseth leaned in, his voice dripping with condescension. Africa, he said, drawing out the word, still struggles because it never learned to stand without us. Leaders like you, Captain Traoré, talk about independence, but you rely on us more than you admit. The audience gasped softly at the audacity. The camera quickly shifted to Traoré, who sat perfectly still, his eyes narrowing but his body unmoving. For a long second, silence filled the room. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, as though every person present was holding their breath, waiting to see how Traoré would respond. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He let Hegseth's words hang in the air like smoke, slowly filling the space with their weight. And then, as the tension reached its peak, Traoré finally spoke, his voice calm, deliberate, but carrying a weight that shook the studio more than any raised shout ever could. Traoré leaned forward slightly, the studio lights glinting off the insignia on his uniform. His voice, steady but laced with steel, carried across the set. "You say we rely on you," he began, his tone measured, "but tell me, who relies on Africa's gold, its oil, its rare earths? Who leans on Africa to power their industries, their phones, their satellites?" The words landed heavy, and the audience stirred. Hegseth shifted in his chair, the smirk faltering for a moment, though he tried to mask it with a quick shuffle of his notes. Traoré didn't relent. His eyes locked onto Hegseth like a soldier on target, unwavering and uncompromising. "You mistake silence for weakness," Traoré continued. "You confuse patience with dependence. But Africa's patience has ended. And when a continent decides to rise, no anchor, no chain, no smirk from across the ocean can stop it." The room crackled with tension. Even the cameras seemed to zoom in closer, as if the lenses themselves were drawn to the fire in his words. Some in the audience nodded in approval, others whispered, but none looked away. It was clear that this wasn't just a debate on television, it was a clash of worldviews, a verbal battlefield where every phrase carried the weight of history. And in that moment, Traoré's calm defiance made the silence before his words seem louder than Hegseth's entire opening monologue. Hegseth leaned back, regaining some of his composure, and forced a laugh. "Without us, without American leadership, Africa would collapse. Look around you. Infrastructure, technology, defense, it's all been handed to you," he said, jabbing a finger in the air as though to punctuate his superiority. But Traoré did not blink. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set like granite. When he spoke, it was not with anger, but with the controlled authority of a man who had stood in battlefields and seen nations bend. "Collapse," he repeated, his voice deepening with contempt. "The only thing collapsing is the illusion that you own our future. Africa is not your apprentice. We are not clay for your hands. We are iron forged by fire, and iron does not bend to a smirk on television." The audience erupted, some clapping, others gasping. The camera cut between Hegseth's flushed face and Traoré's unshaken expression. Every word Traoré delivered landed like a strike, cutting through decades of condescension and rewriting the script live, in front of millions. "You speak of what you've given," Traoré continued, leaning closer to the mic, "but what have you taken? Minerals, resources, labor, dignity. And still you dare stand before the world and call yourselves teachers of freedom. You are no teachers. You are thieves who fear the day the house you built on stolen ground begins to crumble." Hegseth shifted again, the air of confidence slipping like sand through his fingers. The debate was no longer about who could out-talk the other, it was about who could embody the will of a people. And in that moment, the studio felt less like a stage and more like the courtroom of history, where Africa itself was speaking through Traoré. The tension in the studio grew heavier with every passing second. Pete Hegseth tried to mask his discomfort by chuckling into the microphone, his tone dripping with forced bravado. "Strong words, Captain," he mocked. "But words don't build nations. America builds nations. Without us, you'd still be in the dark, waiting for handouts." His words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. For a moment, silence filled the studio, not the silence of agreement, but of anticipation. The audience knew what was coming. Traoré leaned forward, his broad shoulders commanding the frame, his gaze piercing straight through the camera. "You call us beggars," he began, his tone calm but thunderous beneath its restraint. "But it is your fear that begs for reassurance. Fear of losing control. Fear of a continent that no longer kneels. Fear that the hand you extended was never to build, but to take, to strip, to drain." Gasps rippled across the crowd. Hegseth shifted in his chair, visibly agitated, yet powerless to cut in. Traoré pressed on, his voice rising like a drumbeat of defiance. "We do not need your handouts. We do not need your guardianship. Africa is not your child. We are nations with our own fire, our own strength, our own destiny. And the world is beginning to see it." The audience burst into applause, many rising to their feet. Even the cameramen, usually neutral observers, couldn't hide their astonishment at the electricity charging the air. The studio lights glared down, but it was Traoré who shone brightest, unyielding, unafraid. For the first time, Hegseth leaned back, his smirk gone. He wasn't debating a leader anymore, he was facing a force of history in motion. The studio atmosphere had completely transformed. What began as a staged debate for ratings now felt like history being written live. The audience wasn't just watching a program, they were witnessing a clash of two worldviews. Pete Hegseth cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. "Strong speeches won't change reality," he barked. "America is still the backbone of global order. Without us, Africa collapses. Without us, your leaders fall." But his words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The camera caught the unease in his eyes, the strain in his forced authority. Traoré sat taller, his voice steady, commanding. "Global order," he repeated, his tone laced with sharp irony. "Your order is nothing but chains, your backbone nothing but a whip. You mistake dominance for stability, theft for generosity, and silence for consent. That illusion is shattering, here, now, in front of your own people." The audience erupted, some clapping, others shouting in agreement. Social media feeds lit up as the broadcast was clipped and shared in real time. Traoré versus Hegseth was already trending. Hegseth clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling. "So what's your plan, then?" he snapped. "Stand on pride while your people starve? March on slogans while the world moves on?" Traoré leaned forward, eyes locked on him, voice like steel. "Our plan is simple. To rise by our own hands. To feed our people with our land, not with your leftovers. To guard our dignity with our blood, not with your pity. And to remind the world that Africa is not a shadow, we are the dawn." The words hit like thunder. The studio audience leapt to their feet in roaring applause. The sound rolled over Hegseth like a wave he could not stop. The debate was no longer his, it belonged to Traoré. The camera zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of tension on their faces. Pete Hegseth's polished confidence was crumbling. His voice grew sharper, almost desperate. "You can roar all you want, Traoré, but without America's approval, you're nothing but noise. Your countries are unstable, your economies weak, your armies under-equipped. Who will stand with you when the storm comes? He smirked, trying to ignite doubt. But the audience wasn't buying it. The energy in the studio pulsed like electricity, and all eyes locked on Traoré. Traoré leaned into the microphone, his tone unshaken, his words deliberate. "Who will stand with us? Our people will. And that is enough. You underestimate the power of a people defending their dignity. You think allies are bought. We know allies are born from shared struggle. Africa does not need your permission to exist. We do not need your stamp to breathe." The audience cheered, a wave of clapping and shouts rising to the rafters. Even some of Hegseth's fellow commentators, seated off to the side, exchanged uneasy glances. But Traoré wasn't finished. He raised his hand to silence the applause, his eyes burning with conviction. "And let me remind you, Mr. Hegseth, instability is not born from us, it is planted by you. Weapons that flow across our borders, debts that chain our economies, propaganda that poisons our image, these are the storms you speak of. But storms pass. Africa remains." The crowd erupted again, the applause thundering so loud it nearly drowned out the microphones. Hegseth shifted in his seat, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. It was no longer just a debate. It was a reckoning, broadcast live, unstoppable. Pete Hegseth's composure cracked further. His face flushed under the studio lights, his smirk replaced by tight frustration. He jabbed his finger toward Traoré, voice raised, "Strong words won't feed your people. Strong words won't stop chaos when your borders burn. Without America, you'll fall apart like you always have." His words echoed with arrogance, but the reaction was immediate, gasps, jeers, and even laughter from parts of the audience. The line had crossed from confidence into condescension. Traoré, however, remained calm. His silence stretched for a beat, commanding attention before he spoke. "You confuse survival with dependence," he said, his voice measured but heavy with force. "We have endured centuries of storms you unleashed, yet we remain standing. Your empires crumble, your leaders fade, but Africa remains. And this time, we are not surviving, we are rising." The studio shook with applause, louder than before. Even through the cameras, millions watching at home could feel the tide shift. Traoré wasn't simply responding, he was dismantling the foundation of Hegseth's argument. Leaning forward, Traoré added, "And let me be clear. Hunger is not born from African soil, it is born from the theft of it. Chaos is not our nature, it is the shadow of foreign hands stirring division. You claim we need America to survive? No, Mr. Hegseth. It is America that fears what Africa becomes once free." The studio audience exploded. Some stood on their feet, clapping wildly. Hashtags surged online, hashtag Africa Rises, hashtag Trayor Hegseth, hashtag Truth on Live TV. Hegseth sat frozen, his rebuttal trapped in his throat. For the first time, it wasn't Traoré being questioned. It was America's image itself. The atmosphere inside the studio had transformed into something electric, almost combustible. The audience no longer sat quietly, every word carried weight, every pause pulled them further into the clash. Pete Hegseth, visibly unsettled, attempted to regain control. He leaned back, forcing a smile that didn't quite land. "Big speeches, Traoré. But words don't build nations. Power does. And America has it, Africa doesn't." The words echoed with a hollow arrogance. A ripple of disapproval moved through the crowd, some booed, others shouted back. It was clear the balance had shifted. Hegseth, once commanding, now looked like a man standing against the tide. Traoré slowly adjusted his posture, his military bearing unshaken. His voice, low but resonant, sliced through the noise. "Power is not measured by how much you can take. Power is measured by how much you can build. And Africa is building." He paused, letting the audience breathe in his words before delivering the blow. "You confuse domination with leadership. You confuse fear with respect. And you confuse control with unity. But Africa is no longer confused. The audience erupted, clapping, chanting his name. The cameras swung across the crowd, capturing faces lit up with pride, defiance, and raw energy. Traoré continued, his eyes fixed firmly on Hegseth. And let me remind you, America's so-called power is fragile. Empires fall not because they are defeated in battle, but because they rot from within. If you think Africa is weak, remember this: it is the weak who underestimate the strength of the rising. Hegseth tried to speak, but his words drowned in the thunder of applause. Social media exploded, clips of Traoré's fiery reply spread instantly, hashtags trending across continents. This was no longer a debate. It had become a symbol, a moment etched in memory. The studio lights bore down on Pete Hegseth, sweat forming on his forehead as the crowd's energy swelled against him. He forced a laugh, but it sounded strained, desperate. You think speeches make you strong? You think applause changes history? Without us, your nations collapse. Without America, Africa is nothing but noise. The words hung heavy, and the room shifted. The audience hissed and booed. Even those who had come neutral now felt the arrogance cut too deep. Traoré didn't flinch. His gaze locked on Hegseth, his tone sharpened like steel. History was not written by applause, but neither was it written by threats. It was written by the resilience of people who refused to die. He leaned forward, his voice carrying with unshakable conviction. And make no mistake, Africa is not noise. Africa is the drumbeat of humanity. Every chain that was forged against us has already been broken. And every empire that believed we were nothing has already crumbled into dust. The crowd roared, chants of Africa. Africa, filling the studio. The cameras struggled to capture the eruption of energy, but the sound was undeniable. Hegseth tried to raise his hand, but the wave of chants drowned him. His posture slumped, his authority slipping away in front of millions. Traoré delivered the final strike in that moment, and if you still believe we are nothing, then watch what nothing becomes when it rises. Watch carefully, because you will not be able to stop it. The studio shook with thunderous applause, and the momentum was irreversible. Clips flooded social media within minutes, news outlets rushed to cover the clash, and the world saw clearly who had left the stronger mark. The studio had turned into a storm, chants, clapping, voices echoing with energy. Pete Hegseth sat back, eyes darting, his confidence gone. He tried to smile, but the mask cracked. Millions watching across the world could see the shift. This was no longer his stage. Traoré rose slightly from his chair, his military presence commanding silence. When he spoke, the crowd leaned in. Africa has listened to your insults for centuries. We've heard you call us weak, poor, dependent. But tonight, on this stage, let the world witness the truth: Africa does not bow. Africa does not break. Africa stands. The roar of the audience nearly shook the cameras. Some stood, clapping, others chanted his name. The host attempted to cut in, but the energy in the room swallowed any attempt to move on. Traoré's voice grew even sharper, cutting through the thunder. And remember this: the age of silencing us is over. Every attempt to belittle us only reveals your fear. Because deep down, you know that Africa rising means your dominance falling. Hegseth opened his mouth but no sound came. The studio lights caught his uneasy expression, his hands gripping the desk, his confidence fully shattered. Traoré ended with a calm, chilling certainty: you said we are nothing. And yet tonight, it is you who cannot speak. The world is watching, and they have seen enough. The crowd exploded, the chants louder than ever: Africa. Africa. Social media platforms lit up, clips from the confrontation spreading like wildfire. The narrative was sealed. Traoré didn't just win an argument, he redefined the moment. This was history made on live television. Tonight was not just a debate, it was a reminder. Africa will no longer be spoken for, silenced, or underestimated. Every voice that tried to diminish us has only amplified our strength. And let the world hear this. Africa does not bow, Africa does not break, Africa stands. The future belongs to those who stand firm, and we will never step back.